The title of the panorama program, Death in the Med, is inappropriate. 9 humanitarians bringing aid to Gaza were murdered by Israelis on the morning of May 31, 2010 in international waters. But not even where they were killed was spelled out in full.
Self-defense or excessive force? What really happened that night?
Whatever happened, the BBC's panorama team failed to give a balanced view of it, and it would take twice as long as the actual programme to do a full analysis. But here's an excerpt which sets the tone for this so-called documentary.
The first helicopter hovered over the top deck of the ship. The commandos inside were armed with non-lethal weapons, but each man also had a pistol.
Just one of the pathetic attempts to try to tone down, even excuse Israel's worst atrocity since Operation Cast Lead. Documentaries should be truthful and informative and expand our understanding of situations and events. Their content should be rigorously checked for errors in statements which are presented as facts. Conjecture and the personal opinions of their writers and presenters should be explicitly identified as such.
Here in Gaza, the problem's not so much a lack of food or medicine. There's no easy access in and out, no economic life because of the Israeli embargo. Hamas, which rules here, refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist.
A disgracefully inaccurate overview of this imposed humanitarian disaster. The lack of food and medical supplies are huge problems, and the phrase, Hamas refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist, a worn-out media mantra. The reality is that Hamas refuses to recognize what Israel insists is its God-given right to keep stealing Palestinian land. Palestine was stolen from its people, but Israel treats its victims appallingly, ignoring countless United Nations resolutions framed to stop them from doing so. But instead of giving some of the historical background behind the reasons for the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, what was trotted out was the trusty old rocket accusation.
Militants have fired thousands of rockets at civilian targets in Israel in the past few years.
True, but the main target for these non-exploding rockets is Sderot, whose history is linked to this tale of theft and woe as Sodom is to Gomorrah. In 1948, the Jewish Negev Brigade totally destroyed the little Palestinian town of Najd, close to where Sderot now stands, and its former inhabitants were forced to take refuge in Gaza, where, over 60 years later, some of their descendants are now imprisoned, including 800,000 children whose only offence is that they were born Palestinians. In November 2008, a truce with Hamas, which had held for 6 months, was broken.
The Israeli spokesperson have been spreading lies all over. The reality and the truth is that the side that broke this truce and this ceasefire was Israel.
There was an attack. It was an Israeli raid that took out 6 people. Now, let me refer you. It's not just us. We checked in other periodicals. Johnny, go over my shoulder if you can. Here we go. The 6-month ceasefire started coming apart at the beginning of November after Israeli commandos killed a team of Hamas fighters during a raid on a tunnel they suspected was being dug for kidnapping of Israeli soldiers. That raid set off more Palestinian rocketing.
And no wonder. The Gaza blockade and Operation Cast Lead have had disastrous consequences for an already traumatized population, with the destruction or disabling of homes and factories, water and sewage treatment plants, electricity generating and distribution stations, vital agricultural land, buildings and machinery. With anemia, malnutrition and other medical conditions running rampant, the highest unemployment rate in the world, around 40%, and with all forms of international aid being controlled by, that's right, apartheid Israel, whose so-called defense forces left this charming 60-meter calling card in a Gazan agricultural field. These are the people who are imposing such appalling living conditions on Gaza, yet all you could mention, Miss Corbyn, is the frustrated reaction to it all.
Militants have fired thousands of rockets at civilian targets in Israel in the past few years.
But you found time to be critical of those coming to their aid.
The IHH invited fellow Islamists from across the Arab world. Several of them made speeches against Israel on board. Then the head of the IHH, Bülent Yildirim, turned up the rhetoric.
A totally unwarranted remark. The rhetoric is certainly being turned up, not by those on board the ship, but by the biased BBC.
I went to talk to Mr. Yildirim at the charity's headquarters in the most Islamic area of Istanbul.
What an odd remark. Turkey's population is 99% Muslim, so most of Istanbul would be Islamic.
The IHH isn't just known for their humanitarian work. Western authorities have accused them of having links to terrorist organizations.
Without any proof, that was pure mudslinging innuendo and has no place in a documentary.
You said that if they, the Israelis, board the ship, we will throw them into the sea. Isn't that a provocation to be saying that to your followers on the ship?
Advising one's colleagues about how to protect themselves against aggression is not a provocation. With great respect, Mr. Yildirim, there was no need for you to answer a question which should never have been asked. But it gets better.
On the evening of the 30th, people were settling down to sleep on the ship.
Or worse, depending on your point of view.
Spirits were high.
Mavi Marmara, you are approaching an area of hostilities.
At 9 o'clock, the Israeli Navy gave the first of 5 warnings to the flotilla to turn back.
If you ignore this order and attempt to enter the blockaded area, the Israeli Navy will be forced to take all the necessary measures in order to enforce this blockade.
The Israelis released what they said was the radio response from the flotilla. Part of it was defiant and abusive.
Shut up, go back to Auschwitz. We're helping Arabs going against the U.S. Don't forget 9/11, guys.
The recording's authenticity has provoked controversy. The flotilla's organizers insist they did not hear these comments being made.
And the visual appears to back them up. The Auschwitz comment would have been offensive to an Israeli, but neither of these two batted an eyelid at it.
Shut up, go back to Auschwitz. We're helping Arabs going against the U.S. Don't forget 9/11, guys.
And the 9/11 comment doesn't make sense. So who decided that this unsubstantiated material should be included in the program? And why?
If I die as a shaheed, I just want to tell my children, my wife, that I love them a lot. Their father died for a really good cause.
A sincere message from a husband and father? Not according to Miss Corbyn.
At least one man openly boasted he'd be prepared to die as a shaheed, a martyr, fighting the Israelis.
The program was peppered with this kind of hyperbole.
Video shows IHH activists cutting metal bars from the ship's railings that night.
As though it was not good form to be prepared for a possible attack.
The security cameras on the ship show the IHH men on the top deck with bars and wooden staves. A former US Marine turned activist was assigned to the second deck. His name, Ken O'Keefe.
I was given the opportunity to either be a part of filming or witnessing or actively defending the ship, and I made the decision to defend it.
Although that could lead to confrontation.
The real problem here is the occupation, the blockade. That is the problem. It must end. Now, if it requires confrontation in which we use non-lethal force to defend ourselves and our mission, then so be it.
The UN Commission has called Israel's and Egypt's blockade of Gaza a war crime.
Making the blockade's enforcement a war crime as well, and giving those on the ship every right to resist under international law. But the BBC failed to mention that. Instead, Jane Corbyn's commentary has an air of faint disapproval about the way those on board the ship reacted to the Israeli threat. Yet these compassionate people from various countries and walks of life were putting their lives at risk, attempting to do what the United Nations has failed to do since June 2007.
By now, they weren't just passengers down there.
They hauled 2 soldiers down here, bleeding and wounded.
An IHH volunteer took charge of the Israeli commandos. Captain R was one of the wounded Israelis taken below.
I felt this was the moment. Any minute I am going to die.
Unlike 9 of the humanitarians, the anonymous Captain R did not die. He and 2 other commandos were given first aid and later released. They were not held hostage against the demands of the Mavi Marmara's attackers, as they could have been. They were released. But Jane Corbyn could not bring herself to acknowledge this indisputable humanitarian action.
me and another soldier found ourselves alone, and we just jumped off the bow into the water.
All 3 Israeli commandos were rescued.
Ken O'Keefe and others characterized this as a blatant lie, because they know that the commandos were released, not rescued. But Miss Corbyn will probably claim that she meant rescued from the water, although we don't even know if the 3rd released commando had jumped off the ship. To my way of thinking, Jane Corbyn set up her targets very early in the programme and was not about to let an inconvenient fact about the actions of the people she seemed determined to denigrate spoil her aim.
But did Israel fall into a trap? And what was the real agenda of some of those people who call themselves peace activists on board the Free Gaza Flotilla?
As we have already seen, she was determined to turn reality upside down.
Isn't that a provocation to be saying that to your followers on the ship?
And I made the decision to defend it.
Although that could lead to confrontation.
Now it's time for Spot the Missing Question.
But at least in one case, they did use their weapon, because we found bullets and shells of weapons that is not in use in the Israeli forces.
The question that was not asked was, can I see this evidence? A great show was made of some of the weapons that the Israelis say they found on the Mavi Marmara, but of the alleged handgun, not a sign. If I'd been in charge of that exhibition, I would have put it in a special glass case. This segment is from BBC Newsnight, June 1st, 2010.
The Israelis have maintained they put people aboard with non-lethal weapons and pistols for their own defence. But this man seems to be carrying a suppressed version of the Uzi submachine gun.
Talk about a provocation, but Jane Corbyn chose not to question any of the Israelis about that either. Too confrontational, perhaps.
The Mavi Marmara didn't break the blockade of Gaza, but it did spark international outrage.
Justifiable outrage against the Israelis' use of excessive force, resulting in the deaths of these 9 men. It is well known that the early hours of the morning are when a person's psychological state is at its lowest ebb. So why weren't the Israelis asked why this time was chosen? Wouldn't around 9 a.m. have been a more upbeat and hopeful time for a peaceful conclusion to what everyone must have known was going to be a confrontation? That important issue was never brought up, but there was still time for another metaphorical slap in the face for the humanitarians.
So what about the aid the IHH said was the reason for their mission? Some of it's arrived in Gaza from Israel and it's sitting in a warehouse. Mobility scooters, hospital beds and drugs. But I found that 2/3 of the medicines are out of date and useless.
Apart from the fact that some of this packaging is still intact, her statement about the drugs being
useless
is grossly inaccurate. In tests carried out for the US military, the FDA found that 90% of more than 100 drugs they tested were perfectly safe to use even 15 years after their printed expiry dates. So, having attempted to characterize the Gaza Freedom Flotilla's mission as being pretty useless, and gone out of its way to avoid calling the Israelis to account for 9 tragic and avoidable deaths, let's see how Jane Corbyn, on behalf of the BBC's Panorama team, presents their findings.
At the end of the day, the bid to break the naval blockade wasn't really about bringing aid to Gaza. It was a political move designed to put pressure on Israel and the international community.
And in turn, the obvious purpose of Panorama's Death in the Med was designed to take some of that pressure off Israel. The BBC's television and radio services reach an audience measured in hundreds of millions worldwide, but are primarily funded by taxes and license fees paid by the British public, not by Israel or its influential friends. So Panorama's biased and often untruthful treatment of Israel's worst atrocity since Operation Cast Lead should trigger a public inquiry about who is really in charge of one of the most influential broadcasters on the planet.